title of our section today is Why Our Attitudes and Beliefs Never Change. It's funny, when I first got involved with addiction in 1975, people said, why are you interested in addiction? And what I might have said then is, well, I'm interested in something that will never, ever be cured, but will only continue and possibly grow worse for the rest of my life. And, you know, I started working on love and addiction when I was 25, and I'm 75 now.
Isn't that just called job security?
Yeah. I just figured I'd pick something, you know, I didn't want to get into cancer research. So I figured, let's do addiction, you know. We might actually solve some other problems, but let's stick with something incurable. But I don't mean incurable in the same way. I mean, not because people don't get over addictions. You and I have gone over a million times how people outgrow addictions. That's a standard reaction. But our attitudes never change. They can't change. They're factually inescapable. And the thing that's amusing to me about that is people like make fun. Many of the people we know, we're in the progressive community, make fun of Trump's supporters who, you know, still haven't gotten over like the election results and can't deal with that reality. Our population can't deal with the reality of addiction.
Yeah.
We can do our best to try and explain it, but what can you do? So today we begin by talking about two famous journalists who become involved with people that we are aware of. David Brooks interviewed, this is some years ago, Scott Lilienfeld and Sally Satel at the American Enterprise Institute about their book, Brainwashed: The Seductive Appeal of Mindless Brain Neuroscience. And David Brooks, of course, prides himself on being extremely well informed about data, and he had previously interviewed Sally. So he's well informed. During the course of their podcast, they did a video interview at AEI. He just casually says, oh, of course, nobody ever gets over addiction. So Sally, to her credit, bless her little heart, said, well, that's not true. You would have thought that somewhere in his interviewing her for a whole column and reading her book, he might have known this. But Sally, she doesn't like to call attention to herself. And so she says, well, that's just not true. Most people outgrow it. And she objects. And then the whole podcast goes on. If you talk to David Brooks today and said, oh, most people get over addiction, I don't know the answer to this. What do you guess he might say?
I guess probably the same thing.
That's my guess.
I mean, I was trying to think of some monumental shift in his thinking where it could have come from. I can't think of anything.
He'd say the same thing because that's just true. And, you know, I'm writing my memoir, and, you know, I talk about that AEI interview, and I say why I'm not as popular as I might be. If I would have been there, I would have made a commotion. It's just my nature. I would have said, David, what would give you that impression? You're a person who's proud of knowing the data. Why would you have such a misapprehension? Then I would turn to the audience, and what would I say to them? Can you guess what I would do?
You probably involve them in some sort of exercise. They prove
exactly. I'd say, what's the toughest
addiction
to quit? They would say smoking, and 95% of them. And then the cameraman, I'm just guessing, would say, well, I quit smoking, you know. So I said, David, how come you don't know that when your cameraman knows it and everybody in the audience knows it? And the answer is, well, there's just a truth that people become addicted to drugs and they don't get better. Everybody knows that. And so who cares about the data? We refer to NESARC, and there's NLAs, and every study that ever looks at people over their lifetimes finds out that most people outgrow addiction. But you're not allowed to know that. The myths are so strong that they cultivate people's attention. And Sally's polite. She's a petite, polite woman. She's not going to confront David with his monumental, persistent, recalcitrant ignorance. That's not going to happen. So, you know, if you talk to David Brooks tomorrow, I think that interview was conducted maybe in 2013. He'll say the same thing. So let's go on to Kurt Andersen. Kurt Andersen is kind of the prototypical New York intellectual. He writes for New York Magazine. He has his own radio show. He writes fiction novels. He's a genius. And he lives in Brooklyn like I do. So he's written a new book, and he's on the media now. It's called Evil Geniuses, The Unmaking of America. Let me try and summarize that book in a sentence. He is doing a mea culpa because when he was commenting on inequality in America, he didn't recognize his own involvement in that. And this is something important to us. We're not going to talk about it right now. Americans aren't addicted en masse. You know, we aren't getting record levels of drug deaths because people are violating AA's precepts or because people are getting prescriptions for opioids. Something is happening in American society, and David Brooks is aware of it, and Kurt Andersen is aware of it. And to summarize that development in one sentence, a large segment of Americans are not participating in the American dream. Their lives are going downhill. And that corresponds with rampant, chaotic, negative use of substances, which lead to greater death levels. And, you know, going to AA isn't going to solve that. Before Kurt Andersen's book on evil geniuses, he wrote a book called Fantasyland, How America Went Haywire. He's a great believer in rationality, Kurt Andersen. He believes that we follow all kinds of crazy myths. We believe every kind of bullshit that comes down the pike. And in line with that, I had a little interaction with Kurt. Writing for New York Magazine, this is what he wrote. This is back to George W. Bush, who you may remember was the president before Obama. Andersen wrote, the psychological defense mechanism of denial, unconsciously downplaying or ignoring unpleasant facts, is an impulse most people outgrow after childhood. But at Yale, remember, Bush was a cheerleader, as well as a substance abuser who apparently can't admit the problem until he was middle-aged. We made a swing from booze land to teetotaler with a plunge into Christian faith, but apparently without the 12 steps.
Can you imagine that?
Kurt Andersen, Mr. Rationality, an atheist, is cutting up George W. Bush because he quit drinking on his own.
If you have it there, will you read that? I interrupted you before you were done the sentence, but I think it really caps it off. Well, here, I got it. So without the 12 steps that require rigorously abandoning the habit of denial.
And so he goes on to explain the Iraq War based on that. This is Mr. Rationality. Consider the great failures of his administration. Katrina, Iraq, the unwillingness to address global warming, and arguably before 9/11, Islamic terrorism. Denial runs through them all. So I wrote a piece in Psychology Today. Let's commend facts-based thinking, except for alcoholism. So Kurt Andersen, Mr. Rationality, is willing to take on a mea culpa for being participant in equality. But when you get down to alcoholism, let's get real. Let's get real. I mean, George W. Bush's story about why he quit drinking was he embarrassed himself in front of his family, which is very important. He didn't like fall down sloppy drunk, but he said some inappropriate things. And he told his wife, Laura, you know, I'm going to stop drinking. Can you believe the chutzpah of that man? To decide the drinking wasn't working for him and to decide not to drink anymore. And as a result, according to Kurt Andersen, Mr. Rationality, he invaded Iraq. So that just goes to show the danger that if you talk to Kurt Andersen, I actually interchanged with him in New York Magazine. I said, what? He's not allowed to quit drinking because he's a, you know, and if I would have done the same exercise. I don't know Kurt Andersen. I would have said, did you ever smoke? That's often a good way to get into this discussion. He might very well have said, yes. I said, oh, have you quit? And he'd probably say, yes. I'm making this up. Why did you quit? Well, you know, my wife got pregnant or I developed a cough and I quit. And then I would say, oh, are are you in denial? I mean, you didn't realize you were addicted and you needed a 12-step group or some kind of nicotine replacement. You just quit. So why we can't ever, and this brings up a current event topic. Our good friend Carl Hart, who you're going to be interviewing shortly, has written a book called Drug Use for Grown-Ups, and it was reviewed in the New York Times. I'm just going to read, if I can pull it up here, the first paragraph of the review. The title is When Getting High is a Hobby, Not a Habit. What's that mean? What are they saying? When getting high is a hobby, not a habit?
It doesn't mean anything. You can get high, you can use a drug, and it's not going to capture you and slave you. You're just kind of doing it. Although I don't know that Carl would say call it a hobby. I think he'd call it something.
I don't think he'd call it a hobby. In fact, he
useful.
calls it something worse.
Yeah, much worse.
He actually says it's beneficial.
Sorry.
Which is really funny. So you're going to interview Carl.
Yeah.
I have something of a history with Carl. When I'm present, when Carl speaks, which has happened more than once, Carl begins his lecture by saying Stanton Peele's in the audience, and he varies. He says, I owe much of what or most of what I say Stanton Peele said before. So here's the first paragraph in the New York Times review of Carl Hart's book, which is People Use Drugs. It doesn't take long to get to what is perhaps the boldest and most controversial statement in Carl Hart's new book, Drug Use for Grown-Ups. In the prologue, he writes, I'm now entering my 5th year as a regular heroin user. And here's the reviewer goes, in all honesty, I don't know how to feel about this admission. Translation, well, I don't believe that. That's not possible. It's not easy to square all that I've learned about this drug. Now, where has this person learned about heroin, would you guess? You and I don't know him. Where would you guess he's learned about heroin?
From the runoff of the shibboleth that everybody speaks about heroin? From the New York Times editorial, Kurt Andersen, David Brooks.
And some movies he's seen, like The Man with the Golden Arm.
Right.
And it's not easy to square with all that I've learned about this drug, learned my ass, with the image I also hold of Hart. He has an image of heroin. He doesn't have an image of Hart. He has information about Hart. A tenured professor of psychology at Columbia University, an experienced neuroscientist. That's not an image.
Yeah.
That's Carl's resume.
That's his CV, right? Exactly.
He's got it reversed. So
this doesn't. But so basically, this doesn't. Carl Hart says he does heroin, which is crazy to me after all I know about what I've learned about heroin. Because when I look at Carl Hart's resume, it doesn't say heroin on there, and it doesn't seem like it could possibly jibe with heroin. Weird.
And Carl Hart, who happens to use heroin and be a professor, is saying that both based on him and his own personal experience and his research. And of course, I don't know, how long have I been writing about this, might you guess? Where would you imagine I first began discussing this?
Oh, come on. Probably before 75, right?
Well, okay. And in 1985, I wrote The Meaning of Addiction, where I wrote something like, in terms of the relative likelihood of a human being to become addicted to an involvement with heroin, or once addicted to remain on it or quit or cut back, heroin is not qualitatively different from other experiences. Lee Robbins studied returning heroin addicts. You and I write about this in our book, Outgrowing Addiction. And I'm paraphrasing, in terms of its likelihood to be used every day on the streets of New York, heroin is no more or less addictive than alcohol, marijuana, amphetamines, or barbiturates. In other words, some people tend to overuse them, maybe use them regularly, but you can't look at the drug. Now, remember, the returning Vietnam vets are people who they had a captive population. We don't know about most heroin. Most people don't write books like Carl Hart about using heroin. we know about people who use heroin when they show up in treatment centers. That wasn't true of returning Vietnam vets. They tested positive when they left Vietnam, and then they were in the Army, so they were followed up. So we know about their whole lives. And what we found out was most of them just went back to life, lived normally. And if they were to use street drugs of any kind, heroin was no different from any other drug. Even so, Lee Robbins herself still refers to heroin as like addictive, as though it's different from all the other drugs that she says was one of them. She has 5 things we learned from Vietnam vets that we didn't previously know. And one is, well, heroin's no more likely to be used on a daily basis or addictive basis than any other street drug. So that was written back in 1973. And we still don't know it. This reviewer doesn't know it. This reviewer is proud to know it. This reviewer is saying, well, I don't believe it. And so one time I saw Carl Hart speak. He was interviewed by John Tierney, who happens to be a friend of mine. We both lived in Park Slope. And Carl did his routine. He says, 80, 90% of people who use drugs. One other aspect of this is Carl doesn't discuss addiction. For some complex reason, he doesn't like to get into the addiction equation. He tends to talk about problems. Maybe he would say, well, addiction's a pretty hard to pin down concept, maybe more behavioral. So after the talk, where he thanked me, as usual, a guy came up to me and says, that's not true, is it? I don't believe that. And I said, well, you're talking to the wrong person. If you want me to tell you that Carl Hart's wrong and everybody gets addicted. But I knew John Tierney. He's a great guy. And I said, oh, John, do you believe that? And he said, no. And John's a famous libertarian. He had a column from the New York Times called the Tierney Lab. And the byword on the Tierney Lab was, just because everybody believes something doesn't prove it's wrong, but it's usually a pretty good indication that it is. But okay, everybody believes the myth of addiction. So do I. I mean, there's some myths I'm just not going to give up. So a summary of David Brooks, Kurt Andersen, and whoever this poor schmo is who they gave the job of reviewing Carl Hart's book, and how people are going to react to Carl Hart's book. We never change our ideas about addiction. We never change how we view addiction. And what's critical, of course, is if you blame addiction on a drug, which Carl doesn't, and which you and I don't, well, then you're stuck in the miasma of drug world. You're stuck on demonizing drugs, and you'll never get around to dealing with what Carl speaks about in different contexts. Well, why exactly do people run afoul of drugs, become addicted, or have problems? And drugs are not the cause of the problem. But in America, we just can't deal with that. And you and I have discussed this more than once. As long as you can't deal with that, drug problems and deaths will continue, as they are, to spiral out of control. I guess one last little personal remembrance about all this. In my memoir, I love Sally and Carl. Carl wrote a blurb. I include that Carl calls me a role model in my blurbs for the book. Sally, who wrote a blurb for our book, is the Carl, Outgrowing Addiction, refused to write a blurb for my memoir. God bless her. I'm good with that. Sally finds me a little too barbed. And in the book, I describe your being present in Vermont when Carl and Sally were in the same panel. And Carl said, well, I took heroin the other night. I had a meeting and I needed it to mellow me out. And Sally said, squawked, did you just say you took heroin? And Carl was sort of, standoffish and said, yeah. And Sally said, but why would you even tell people about that? And that's sort of a point of Carl's book. Nobody knows about heroin users like him, because why would heroin users like him talk about it? African-American professor at Columbia's medical school is not going to fire him. But you do and he actually said to me, how do you deal with all the negative feedback you get from telling the truth about drugs? And my answer to that is, well, I'm not a very good role model for that experience, Carl. I would say you're doing a little better than I am in that school, tenured professor.
Well, let me say a couple of things on the panel with Sally. So this will make your point even more, and it will help restore any image problems now people have with Sally. She wasn't up in arms. In fact, on the panel, she said, and Carl, in her nice, as you say, petite, nice way, well, Carl, I know what you're doing. I know what you're saying. Of course, we agree on X, Y, Z and about drugs, but please don't tell people that. Don't, using illicit drugs. Don't tell people. So there is this anxiety and phobia and just big fear and gasping around. I get, of course, we all get it, but you're going to send the wrong message. And his response was another polite version of, no, I'm sending the message that I'm trying to send. And the message pretty much speaks for itself.
No, I know Sally a bit.
Yeah.
I've had dinner with her. We've had wine together. Sally is not an illicit drug user type. That's not her style. And ironically, Carl, who grew up in the ghetto, refused to use drugs growing up because, as he says in the book, I thought using crack was like shooting yourself in the head. Carl is the unusual example of somebody who became successful and then became a drug user. It's kind of an ironic reversal of fortune.
I often wonder if maybe he wouldn't feel like drugs were such a benefit to him or such a relief if people were just a little easier on him for those beliefs about drugs in the first place. The pushback that he gets is probably not even the pushback, the arrogance that we're talking about, the blindness to truth because of the mythology that is kind of draped over us. I think he struggles in a way, same way that you do, and he has better and worse days when it comes to that. I sometimes wonder if it's, how could you do all of that work without drugs?
I think Carl, obviously, Carl is the first tenured faculty member in the sciences in Columbia University's history. He's got a little more of a burden than me, living in a studio apartment in Brooklyn, although it depends how you judge burdens. You know what I mean? I imagine they pay him a pretty good salary, but he faces pressures. Who can imagine what they are like? I can't project what, his burdens are. It amuses me, as I said, that he sees me as a role model. First of all, very few people see me as a role, but the way I'm a role model is I faced an awful lot of incoming flack in my life without swerving. And, I know what I know, and I refuse to back down from it. So, we'll see what the fallout is from Carl. I mean, from reviews like this, which basically says, you're crazy.